Welcome to the Trump Breaking News Network, your daily source for up-to-the-minute Trump news. Join us today and every day. Here's today's news.
This is TBNN.
Trump warns Xi, trade war with China begins Monday. By Tyler Durden. As if there weren't enough geopolitical and social stress points in the world to fill a lifetime of sleepy, vacationy Augusts, late on Friday night President Trump spoke to Chinese President Xi Jinping and told him that he's preparing to order an investigation into Chinese trade practices next week, according to NBC. Politico confirms that Trump is ready to launch a new trade crackdown on China next week, citing an administration official, a step that Trump delayed 2 weeks ago under the guidance of his new Chief of Staff General Kelly, but now appears imminent. It is also an escalation which most analysts agree will launch a trade war between Washington and Beijing. As Politico details, Trump on Monday will call for an investigation into China over allegations that the nation violated U.S. intellectual property rights and forced technology transfers, the official said. While it's unclear how much detail Trump will get into in the announcement, administration officials expect U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to open an investigation against China under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. The ordering of the investigation will not immediately impose sanctions but could lead to steep tariffs on Chinese goods. Trump has expressed frustration in recent months over what he sees as China's unfair trade policies. As we discussed 2 weeks ago, Trump had planned to launch the trade investigation more than a week ago, but he delayed the move in favor of securing China's support for expanded UN sanctions against North Korea, the senior administration official said. The pending announcement also comes amid heightened tension between the United States and China, even after the Trump administration scored a victory in persuading Beijing to sign on to new United Nations sanctions on North Korea. Still, Trump has delayed trade action before, amid pressure from business groups and major trading partners. Two Commerce Department reports examining whether to restrict steel and aluminum imports on national security grounds were expected by the end of June but have been bottled up in an internal review. Trading partners raised threats of retaliation and domestic steel users complained of being hurt by price increases and restricted supply. The trade investigation will immediately strain relations between the U.S. and China as the two countries wrestle with the unpredictable situation over North Korea. Should Trump follow through, the move will lay the groundwork for Trump to impose tariffs against Chinese imports, which will mark a significant escalation in his efforts to reshape the trade relationship between the world's two largest economies. In other words, even if there is now conventional war announced with either North Korea or Venezuela, Trump's next step is to launch a trade war against China. The United States government can, and does, work with countries to address serious concerns such as North Korea while also pursuing measures to address economic concerns, such as the theft of U.S. intellectual property. 1A, U.S. National Security Council official said. It wasn't immediately clear how China would react to the move. When reports of the potential trade investigation first emerged more than a week ago, China's Commerce Ministry stressed the importance of U.S.-China trade ties and of resolving differences through dialogue and consultation. We would like to emphasize that the Chinese government has always attached importance to intellectual property protection, a spokesman said. The results are there for all to see. Trump, who has been residing at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, for the past week, plans to return to Washington on Monday to officially announce the trade investigation. The decision will not only take action against alleged Chinese violations of U.S. companies' intellectual property rights, but could also be perceived as an attempt by the U.S. government to crank up the pressure on Beijing to rein in North Korea. I think China can do a lot more, Trump told reporters on Thursday. And I think China will do a lot more. As CNN adds, the trade investigation is expected to be only one part of a multi-pronged push by the Trump administration to counter perceived Chinese trade abuses. The administration has been eyeing other moves to rebalance the U.S.-China trading relationship. But analysts have cautioned that Trump faces a huge challenge in his desire to significantly reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China, which last year stood at more than $300 billion. protection measures against some specific items, such as steel and aluminum, may gain political favors, but are not likely to be of much help to rebalance trade, economists at the Institute of International Finance wrote in a research note this week. Meanwhile, as we reported previously, China's state media signaled the nation would hit back immediately against any trade measures, as it has done in past episodes. This time around, the need to project strength domestically is compounded by the looming twice-a-decade leadership reshuffle that may further entrench President Xi Jinping's power. Chinese officials have mulled stemming U.S. imports should retaliation be necessary. Under a draft plan, soybeans have been singled out as the top product that can be dialed back, according to people familiar with the matter. Autos, aircraft and rare earth commodities have also been identified as potential categories for restriction, the people said. Still, Trump's offensive comes at a very sensitive time for Beijing, just weeks ahead of the 19th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping wants everything in his economy to be perfect. Ahead of the 19th Party Congress, the last thing that China will want is a trade war, said Callum Henderson, a managing director for Asia-Pacific at Eurasia Group in Singapore. It is also important that Beijing does not look weak in this context. As such, expect a cautious, proportional response. Of course, ultimately the big question, as Bloomberg puts it, is whether the Trump administration is willing to risk a trade war as it ups the ante. The IMF warned last month that inward-looking policies could derail a global recovery that has so far been resilient to raising tensions over trade. The problem, for both the US and China, is that as Trump gets increasingly more focused on distracting from his numerous domestic scandals, he is likely to take ever more drastic action in the foreign arena, whether that means hot war with North Korea, or trade war with China. So far, it has all been posturing, with little action, said Scott Kennedy, 1A, U.S.-China expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Pressure is building to do something, so the U.S. doesn't look like a complete paper tiger. And while we await the formal announcement on Monday in China's retaliation, below again is a breakdown of the biggest U.S. state winners and losers if and when trade war with China breaks out, from winners and losers when trade war breaks out between the U.S. and China. Who stands to lose, and win, if the U.S. takes aim at the unbalanced trade relationship with China? With total bilateral trade of more than $500 billion a year, the list of potential losers is very long, as Bloomberg analyzed recently. The most notable examples include U.S. companies such as Apple Incorporated, which assemble their products in China for sale in the U.S., and those tapping demand in China's expanding consumer market. U.S. agricultural and transport equipment firms, which meet China's demand for soybeans and aircraft. Manufacturing firms from the U.S. that import intermediate products from China as an input into their production process. Retailers including Walmart Stores Incorporated and the U.S. consumers that benefit from low-price imported consumer electronics, clothes and furniture. Other trade partners caught in the crossfire of poorly targeted tariffs. On steel, for example, U.S. direct imports from China account for less than 3% of the total, below Vietnam. And while conventional wisdom is that the U.S. has a chronic trade deficit with China, it does. The U.S. also runs a nearly $17 billion trade surplus with China for agricultural products. China consumes about half of U.S. soybean exports, America's second-largest planted field crop. Soybean farms are mostly located in the upper Midwest, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, Minnesota and Nebraska. The volumes are so significant that a spike in soybean exports was a noticeable contributor to GDP growth in the second half of last year, as readers may recall. China is also a major buyer of U.S. aircraft, perhaps the only areas of manufacturing where the U.S. retains a competitive edge, though not for much longer. The U.S. also has an $8 billion trade surplus with China in the transportation equipment category. U.S. trade balance with China by product. How about geographically? It may come as a surprise that on a state-by-state basis, 8 U.S. states are running surpluses with China, 6 of which supported Trump in last year's presidential election, including West Virginia. In 2016, Louisiana registered the largest surplus, at 2.9% of the state's GDP. Louisiana's exports to China are likely inflated given that 60% of U.S. soybean exports are shipped through the Gulf Coast. Washington state was second at 1.6% of GDP, largely due to aerospace exports. Tennessee maintains the largest trade deficit with China at 6.5% of GDP, meaning tariff-induced increases in the price of imports could have the biggest impact on this state. The biggest losers? Mississippi, Georgia, Illinois, and California, all of which maintain deficits at more than 3% of GDP. For the sake of brevity, we will not discuss another, more troubling, aspect of conventional wisdom, namely that trade wars almost inevitably lead to real wars. Aside for the U.S. military-industrial complex, there are no winners there.
That's the news. Join us here every day. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell. See you next time.
This is TBNN.